What's up, everybody? Just got back from seeing Beetlejuice, so let's talk about it. Before I start talking about this movie, I basically did want to mention, where I kind of stand with the original movie. It was a movie that I did grow up watching. It wasn't a movie, though, that I was overly obsessed with, right? Obviously, the two big movies of the late 80s that made Michael Keaton, famous and iconic, was Batman and Beetlejuice. And I was definitely one of the people and one of the kids that was more obsessed with Batman than I was with Beetlejuice. But I did like the original movie. I actually rewatched it for the first time in quite a long time before I went and saw this movie. And I very much enjoyed it. Keaton's great in it, even though he's not in it for a long time. And the aesthetic, the vibe, the weirdness, and everything is a good movie, right? And even though I'm not overtly obsessed with it, I understand the cultural impact that it had, and I understand why a lot of people do love that original movie. So with that being said, the first thing I have to talk about with Beetlejuice is that 36 years later, Michael Keaton is still absolutely fantastic in this role. He's funny. His line delivery is great. He just slipped back into character in this role. He didn't skip a beat all these years later, just like I felt like he did with Batman in last year's The Flash. So it's pretty cool to see that all these years later that he still can do such a great job with both of these roles. And the reason I think, too, it was so easy for him to slip back into this role is that, in general, this movie just does a very great job of recapturing the vibe of that original film. This felt like a great continuation of that universe, of these characters, and anyone I think that is a huge fan of that original movie is really going to enjoy this movie because the vibe and everything about it feels the same way that the original did. I think it was good that Tim Burton came back specifically to direct this movie. You got Danny Elfman on the score, which I felt like really, kind of made that familiarity feel good and a little bit of nostalgia in there. But yeah, in general, this movie does a great job at recapturing that feel and that vibe of the original film. And I will say that I felt in this movie, compared to the original, that I was more invested in the characters of this film and the storylines that they were going through. There's a certain event that happens. I won't spoil anything in this film, but you kind of can probably guess it from the trailers. That kind of sets the events of this film in motion. And I was more invested in that storyline. I felt like they did a really good job, getting you on board with a lot of the returning characters and then some of the new characters they introduced. So I really felt like this movie did a better job than that original movie did of that. And to piggyback off that, I really think the strongest dynamic in the movie is of the Dietz girls. Obviously you have Lydia and Delia from the original. With this taking place, even in real life and then in the timeline of the movie, 30-something years later, it was really interesting to kind of see the dynamic between those two, because obviously, Lydia was much younger in the first film, so now we're kind of in a more seasoned relationship where they're older, and, you have her daughter, Astrid, in the movie, too. There's kind of some funny jokes about karma and everything for how Lydia treated her, back in the first movie. So just their dynamic in general, I actually really enjoyed and thought was great. And, like I said, certain events happen and it causes these two their relationships to change, how they interact with one another to change. And I just felt like that was handled very well. So I also felt like this movie did a very good job of expanding the lore of how the afterlife works and, the connection between the afterlife, the dead, and the living as well. So that caused the plot to have a lot more stakes, I felt like, than the original movie, when you explored a little bit more of that world and got to know a little bit more of the rules and how that stuff worked. So it made the plot, have more stakes, and you were invested in it a little bit more than you were in that original film. And obviously, in that inherent nature of, the afterlife and death, they really went into a lot of themes on that. And, don't want to spoil anything, but there are certain moments in this movie that revolve around death and around, moving on with your grief and, getting over losing people in your life. And I thought when the movie focused on those types of themes and beats was when it was its strongest and its most emotional. And it's when I cared the most. So I felt like it did a really good job with that, with our characters and making me invested in that way. And one of the main things, that we really loved about that original movie was the fact that for most of the makeup, props, and everything like that, they went practical. This movie does have a little bit more use of CGI, obviously, than the first one did, considering how long ago it was. But I still felt like at the core and at the center, it really stuck and tried to be as practical as possible. And I felt like that was, a big positive for the film. And it made, especially in some of the world-building moments that it had in the film, it worked a lot better that way. I don't mind CGI in films, but I like when it's used sparingly and not for everything, right? And I felt like this movie did a very good job with mostly being practical with just CGI added in when it was needed. Then I also did want to give a shout out to Willem Dafoe, his side character. He wasn't in the movie all that much, but when he was, I thought, he was very much hamming it up, and I thought it was funny, and I thought it was enjoyable. I just kind of wanted to give his character a shout out. I like seeing Willem Dafoe in anything, so yeah. But with everything that I did like about this movie, obviously I did have some issues with it. Definitely wasn't a perfect movie. And naturally, in general, both of the movies now in this series, it's inherently kind of niche, right? It's a very weird two films. Like, I don't know if a casual audience is going to really enjoy this movie that much. Even though my screening was, almost completely sold out. So it's probably going to make some good money. But the nature of these movies are very weird, so I feel like the people who are gonna love this movie is definitely a niche audience. And then I do also feel like this film, especially compared to that original, kind of pushes the boundaries of a PG-13 rating. When it comes to visual things that they did with this film, I really felt like there was definitely some things that were like, whoa, we're going for it here. And then obviously, we get an F-bomb in this movie, just like we did in the first one, so that was pretty cool. So yeah, just a couple things I was just a little bit on with that. But really, the two biggest things that I had a problem with this movie on, and what really knocked it down quite a bit for me is, I talked about how I felt the plot was better. That was only in certain plots of the film, right? There are so many plots in this movie. This movie is way overstuffed. There's way too much going on. And because of that, the plot lines that you actually care about and actually are invested in and actually want to see play out don't get the time that they need. So everything basically feels undercooked by the time this movie is over, because not one of these plot lines is really given the time that is needed in order for it to be fully fleshed out. So that was majorly disappointing for me. It was definitely a huge negative, and it knocks it down like a decent amount of points because of that. And then kind of connected with that, this movie is only an hour and 44 minutes, and that first hour of the film is truly all over the place and doesn't there's really no footing that happens within the first hour. They're essentially just throwing out all these different plot lines and just going through the motions at that point. It's like a bunch of random scenes connected to one another. So that first hour is really not great. Definitely picks up in that last 40 minutes, and I felt like that was the best stretch of the film. But yeah, that first hour and all the plot lines of this film really drags it down for me. Overall, though, I am still positive on this film. Michael Keaton's performance is great. I was invested in all the characters in the film, at least enough to enjoy the film overall. On a rating scale, probably going to give it a 3.25 out of 5. So, I liked it. Felt like it could have been much better if the script would have been, trimmed down a little bit and we would have focused on those things that mattered. All right, guys. Well, if you've seen Beetlejuice, go ahead and comment below. Let me know what you thought. Have a great night.